The town council erupted in laughter when retired Marine Captain Marcus Rodriguez announced he was purchasing the condemned Fort Mitchell military base for $2.3 million. He didn't smile back, and 6 months later, when federal agents surrounded the property with briefcases full of classified documents, nobody was laughing anymore. Among the real estate developers and local politicians gathered in Millbrook's dusty town hall that Tuesday evening, Marcus looked like a man who had lost his mind. Too quiet, too weathered, spending his entire military pension on 847 acres of crumbling concrete and rusted chain-link fence. But one person in that room knew there might be more to this story than anyone could imagine. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus Rodriguez wasn't here to impress the town council or justify his financial decisions to people who had never served their country. He was here to complete a purchase that had been 23 years in the making, ever since the day his unit had been hastily evacuated from Fort Mitchell during what the military had officially classified as a routine base closure. The paperwork was clean, the explanations were simple, but Marcus remembered things differently. He remembered the way his commanding officer's hands had trembled when signing the evacuation orders. He remembered the convoy of unmarked trucks that had arrived in the middle of the night, loaded with equipment that bore no military designations. Most of all, he remembered the way his squad had been separated for individual debriefings, sworn to secrecy about operations they weren't even sure they had witnessed. Real estate mogul Richard Blackstone, a man who had built shopping centers across 3 counties and turned abandoned factories into luxury condominiums, couldn't resist the opportunity that had just presented itself. His polished shoes reflected the fluorescent lights of the town hall as he surveyed the room, watching his fellow council members exchange glances that mixed amusement with genuine concern for Marcus's mental state. Blackstone had tried to acquire the Fort Mitchell property himself 2 years earlier, seeing potential for a massive residential development that could house thousands of families and generate millions in tax revenue for Millbrook. But the federal bureaucracy had been surprisingly uncooperative, citing environmental concerns and regulatory complications that seemed designed to discourage any serious buyer. "Looks like the Marines are recruiting financial advisors now," Blackstone's voice cut through the diminishing chuckles like a blade through silk, his words carefully chosen to sound concerned rather than cruel. The comment triggered another wave of nervous laughter from the audience, some genuinely amused by what appeared to be a veteran's misguided attempt to relive his military glory days, others uncomfortable with the public nature of what seemed like a very private financial mistake. Marcus Rodriguez remained perfectly still throughout the mockery, his weathered hands clasped behind his back in a position that spoke of decades of military discipline, his gray eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the crowd of faces that seemed determined to find entertainment in his decision. He offered no defensive explanation for his purchase, no detailed business plan that might have satisfied the town's curiosity about his intentions for the property. Instead, he simply stood there, absorbing the ridicule with the same stoic endurance he had once used to survive desert heat and enemy fire, silent and unmoved by the judgment of people who had never risked their lives for anything more dangerous than a difficult real estate negotiation. But those who looked closely might have noticed something in the way Marcus carried himself, something that suggested this purchase was far from the impulsive mistake it appeared to be. On his left wrist, barely visible beneath the cuff of his carefully pressed flannel shirt, the edge of a military tattoo caught the harsh fluorescent light for just a moment before disappearing again. The design looked like coordinates, precise numbers that seemed to reference a specific location. But coordinates to what? The tattoo was accompanied by a small scar that ran from his wrist toward his elbow, the kind of precise mark that suggested surgical intervention rather than combat injury. Most people in the room assumed Marcus was simply another veteran struggling to adjust to civilian life, perhaps hoping to turn his military experience into some kind of survival training facility or patriotic tourist attraction. Council Chairman David Hayes, a local banker who had served Millbrook's financial community for over 30 years, watched the proceedings with growing unease that had nothing to do with Marcus's financial capabilities. Hayes possessed security clearance from his days as a reserve officer in the National Guard, clearance that had required extensive background checks and occasional briefings about sensitive military installations throughout the region. Something about Marcus Rodriguez's bearing, the way he held himself under pressure, triggered fragments of memory from classified briefings about Fort Mitchell that Hayes had received decades earlier. The way Marcus positioned himself in the room, always maintaining clear sight lines to both exits, reminded Hayes of security protocols that were taught only to personnel with access to highly sensitive information. There was something about the retired Marine's tactical awareness, the way his eyes seemed to catalog every person and potential threat in the room, that suggested experience far beyond standard infantry training. Hayes had seen similar behavior in intelligence operatives and special forces personnel, individuals whose training created permanent changes in how they perceived and interacted with their environment. What would you do if everyone in your hometown thought you were making the biggest financial mistake of your life? The question hung in the evening air like humidity before a thunderstorm, challenging assumptions and forcing uncomfortable questions about the nature of judgment and the limits of civilian understanding when it came to military decision-making. Marcus Rodriguez had faced this kind of skepticism throughout his adult life, from the day he had enlisted at 18 despite a full scholarship to State University, to his decision to pursue multiple combat deployments when he could have requested stateside assignments. The $2.3 million purchase price represented every penny of Marcus's military pension, his combat pay savings, and the life insurance settlement from his wife Elena's death in a car accident 3 years earlier. Elena had been the only person who truly understood his connection to Fort Mitchell, the only civilian he had ever trusted with fragments of the story about what his unit had discovered during those final weeks before the base closure. She had encouraged his obsession with military history, supported his collection of declassified documents, and shared his belief that some government secrets were too important to remain buried forever. Born and raised in the sprawling suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, Marcus had learned early that strength came not from the volume of your voice, but from the conviction behind your actions. His grandfather's stories of World War II had shaped his understanding of duty and sacrifice, and the antique silver compass Elena had given him on their wedding day served as both a navigation tool and a reminder that some paths could only be discovered through careful observation and patient persistence. The compass never left his pocket, a constant reminder that true direction often required ignoring the obvious routes and trusting in information that others couldn't see or understand. What the town council members didn't know was that Marcus Rodriguez's military service record contained gaps that would have required congressional authorization to access. His official discharge papers listed him as a motor transport specialist, a perfectly respectable but unremarkable military occupation that involved maintaining and operating military vehicles. But deeper investigation, the kind that required security clearances held by perhaps a dozen people in the entire state, would have revealed service with classified special operations units, deployment to locations that didn't appear on any public maps, and commendations for actions that were described only in the vaguest possible terms. Even his medical records from the Veterans Administration carried unusual restrictions, accessible only to doctors with special authorization and military intelligence. Backgrounds. The surgery scar on his wrist wasn't from a combat injury, but from the removal of a subcutaneous tracking device that had been implanted during his service with a classified reconnaissance unit. The device had been designed to monitor vital signs and location data for personnel operating in environments where traditional communication was impossible, but its removal had been ordered during Marcus's discharge as part of security protocols that ensured no classified technology remained in civilian hands. The compass Elena had given him held more significance than anyone in the town hall could have imagined. Inside its antique silver case, hidden beneath the traditional magnetic needle, lay a digital storage device no larger than a grain of rice. The device contained encrypted coordinates, tactical assessments, and photographic evidence that Marcus had collected during his final months at Fort Mitchell, information that he had carefully preserved despite direct orders to forget everything he had witnessed during the base's hurried closure. Richard Blackstone represented everything that modern America valued in its business leaders: aggressive expansion, profit maximization, and the ability to see potential where others saw only problems. His success in real estate development was built on a foundation of careful market research, political connections, and the willingness to take calculated risks that others found too intimidating. But his interest in the Fort Mitchell property went beyond simple financial opportunity. Blackstone had received inquiries from federal contractors about the potential availability of the land, inquiries that came with hints of significant compensation for anyone who could facilitate access to the property. What Blackstone didn't know was that his aggressive pursuit of the Fort Mitchell acquisition had been carefully monitored by federal agencies that maintained ongoing surveillance of the abandoned base. His phone calls to government officials had been recorded, his financial records had been quietly reviewed, and his connections to defense contractors had been mapped with the kind of thoroughness that suggested someone in Washington was very interested in preventing unauthorized access to whatever remained at Fort Mitchell. When Marcus's daughter Isabella Rodriguez Chien arrived at the town hall meeting, her presence immediately changed the atmosphere in ways that neither she nor her father could have anticipated. Isabella approached the building with confident steps, her expression mixing professional competence with personal concern. As a federal prosecutor specializing in military justice and government contracts, she possessed security clearances that exceeded those of most Pentagon officials, clearances that came with knowledge of classified operations that most Americans would find difficult to believe. "Dad, I've been watching the news coverage of your purchase," she said quietly as she entered the town hall, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of prosecuting high-level government corruption cases. "You look determined. The same way you looked when you used to study those Fort Mitchell documents at the kitchen table." Marcus's weathered face showed a flash of emotion at his daughter's words, a mixture of pride and concern that spoke to the complexity of their relationship and the weight of secrets that had shaped their family for decades. "I'm protecting something that needs to be brought to light, Isabella," Marcus replied, his voice carrying conviction that had been forged through years of carrying classified knowledge that he couldn't share with anyone, including his own family. "You wouldn't understand the full scope until you see what's really underneath that property." Isabella's eyes reflected the kind of sharp intelligence that had made her one of the most successful federal prosecutors in her district. But they also showed the sadness of a daughter who had watched her father carry burdens that seemed too heavy for any one person. What neither of them noticed was David Hayes standing within earshot, his expression growing increasingly serious as he processed the implications of their conversation. Hayes's security clearance from his National Guard service was sufficient to access certain classified databases, and Isabella's presence at the meeting suddenly provided context that transformed Marcus's seemingly impulsive purchase into something far more significant and potentially dangerous. During the weeks that followed the town hall meeting, local media coverage of Marcus's purchase intensified, but the stories focused primarily on the human interest angle of a veteran's questionable financial decision rather than any deeper investigation into the property's history or potential value. The Millbrook Gazette ran a feature story titled, "Local Veteran Bets Life Savings on Military Nostalgia," complete with photographs of the rusted fences and crumbling buildings that made Fort Mitchell look like a monument to government waste and military obsolescence. But Marcus's nights were filled with memories that contradicted the official narrative of Fort Mitchell's closure. Memories that seemed too vivid and detailed to be the products of trauma or wishful thinking. He remembered the underground elevators that descended far deeper than any basement should go, the corridors lined with equipment that hummed with electronic energy, and the rooms filled with servers and communication devices that suggested capabilities far beyond anything a standard military base would require. The sound of helicopters flying overhead could trigger reactions that sent him to his bathroom, where he gripped the sink until his knuckles turned white, fighting to distinguish between memory and reality while trying to make sense of experiences that the military had officially classified as never having occurred. The prescription medications from the Veterans Administration helped with the anxiety, but they couldn't erase the certainty that Fort Mitchell contained secrets that were too important to remain buried beneath bureaucratic denial and official amnesia. Someone was watching Marcus's activities with the kind of systematic attention that suggested professional surveillance rather than casual curiosity. His mail was being delivered with subtle signs of tampering. His phone calls were experiencing electronic interference that seemed too consistent to be coincidental, and vehicles with government license plates had been observed in his neighborhood with increasing frequency since his purchase of the Fort Mitchell property became public knowledge. During one particularly sleepless night, Marcus sat in his kitchen with Elena's compass open on the table, studying the encrypted data device hidden within its antique mechanism. The coordinates stored in the device pointed to specific locations within the Fort Mitchell complex, locations where his reconnaissance unit had documented evidence of ongoing classified operations that continued even as the base was being officially decommissioned and abandoned. The compass seemed to pulse with significance in the darkness of his kitchen, its silver surface reflecting the green glow of digital numbers that counted down towards some unknown deadline. Marcus understood that his purchase of Fort Mitchell had started a clock ticking, that forces beyond his control were already moving to either support or suppress whatever truth lay buried beneath 847 acres of seemingly worthless military real estate. The property deed he had signed was more than a simple real estate transaction. It was a declaration of intent that would force long-buried secrets into the light of public scrutiny. But Marcus Rodriguez was no longer the young Marine who had followed orders without question, or the grieving widower who had spent 3 years trying to forget experiences that the government insisted had never occurred. He was a man who had finally acquired the legal right to excavate the truth, regardless of how many powerful people preferred that truth to remain buried forever. Marcus Rodriguez carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that explanations were wasted on people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. To the residents of Millbrook, he appeared to be exactly what Richard Blackstone had suggested, a financially irresponsible veteran chasing ghosts from his military past, perhaps suffering from the kind of post-traumatic stress that made rational decision-making impossible. His daily routine reinforced this perception as he drove his 15-year-old Ford pickup truck through town each morning, stopping at the hardware store for supplies that seemed designed for basic maintenance rather than any serious development project. The contrast between Marcus's modest lifestyle and his multi-million-dollar property purchase created exactly the kind of cognitive dissonance that small-town gossip networks thrived upon. His rental house on Maple Street was a simple 2-bedroom structure with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged under the weight of 20 years of deferred maintenance. His furniture consisted primarily of military surplus items and photographs of his late wife Elena, creating an atmosphere that suggested a man trapped in the past rather than someone planning for the future. What the townspeople couldn't see was the sophisticated surveillance equipment that Marcus had discreetly installed throughout his modest home, devices that monitored electronic communications, detected unauthorized entry attempts, and maintained secure connections to encrypted databases that most civilians didn't know existed. His seemingly casual trips to the hardware store were actually carefully planned reconnaissance missions designed to gather intelligence about who might be taking unusual interest in his activities and whether his communications were being monitored by hostile agencies. Richard Blackstone had built his real estate empire through a combination of aggressive acquisition strategies and an almost supernatural ability to identify properties with hidden potential before their true value became apparent to competitors. His success rate was legendary throughout the region, and his political connections extended from city council chambers to congressional offices where favorable zoning decisions and regulatory exemptions could be arranged with the kind of efficiency that money and influence could provide. But Fort Mitchell represented something different from Blackstone's usual investment targets, something that triggered instincts he had learned to trust during 30 years of high-stakes property development. The federal government's handling of the base closure had been unusually secretive, with environmental assessments that seemed to discourage investigation rather than provide genuine scientific evaluation. Cleanup contracts had been awarded to companies with no public track records, and the timeline for civilian access had been extended repeatedly without satisfactory explanations. Blackstone's initial interest in the property had been motivated by its obvious potential for residential development, but his continued pursuit was driven by something more complex. Phone calls from Washington-based consulting firms had suggested that certain government agencies maintained ongoing interest in the Fort Mitchell site, interest that came with implications of significant financial compensation for anyone who could facilitate discreet access to the property without attracting public attention or media scrutiny. The consulting firms had been careful never to explicitly state what kind of access they required or why federal agencies might need to conduct operations on supposedly abandoned military property. But Blackstone's political experience had taught him to recognize the difference between routine bureaucratic inefficiency and deliberate government secrecy. Fort Mitchell fell definitively into the latter category, which meant that its true value extended far beyond anything that conventional real estate appraisal methods could determine. During his own attempted acquisition of the property, Blackstone had encountered resistance that seemed disproportionate to the apparent insignificance of abandoned military buildings and contaminated soil. Environmental Protection Agency officials had cited concerns about groundwater contamination that required specialized remediation techniques, but when Blackstone had commissioned independent soil and water testing, the results had shown contamination levels well within acceptable ranges for residential development. Department of Defense representatives had insisted that unexploded ordnance posed ongoing safety risks throughout the property, requiring extensive clearance operations that could take years to complete and cost millions of dollars. But Blackstone's research into Fort Mitchell's operational history had revealed that the base had never been used for weapons testing or ammunition storage, making the presence of dangerous ordnance highly unlikely unless it had been placed there deliberately during the base closure process. The pattern of bureaucratic obstruction had convinced Blackstone that Fort Mitchell contained something valuable enough to justify the federal government's elaborate efforts to control access to the property. His assumption was that the value lay in mineral rights, strategic location for intelligence operations, or perhaps environmental cleanup, contracts that could generate substantial profits for the right companies with the appropriate political connections. What Blackstone couldn't have known was that his persistent inquiries about Fort Mitchell had triggered automated alerts within multiple federal agencies, alerts that classified him as a potential security risk requiring continuous monitoring and assessment. His phone calls were being recorded. His financial transactions were being analyzed for patterns that might suggest foreign intelligence connections, and his political relationships were being mapped with the kind of thoroughness that suggested someone in Washington considered him a serious threat to national security interests. The irony of Marcus Rodriguez's successful acquisition of property that Blackstone couldn't obtain despite superior financial resources and political connections was not lost on Millbrook's business community. Local entrepreneurs who had watched Blackstone transform worthless industrial sites into profitable shopping centers couldn't understand how a retired Marine with limited financial resources had managed to complete a transaction that had defeated one of the region's most successful developers. Marcus's success seemed to violate every principle of modern real estate development, from financial leverage to political influence to bureaucratic navigation. His approach had been refreshingly direct. He had submitted a cash offer for the full asking price, provided complete financial documentation within 24 hours, and accepted every condition and restriction that federal agencies had imposed on the sale. The transaction had been completed with an efficiency that suggested either remarkable luck or access to information that other potential buyers had been denied. David Hayes had observed the contrasting fortunes of Blackstone and Marcus with growing suspicion that was informed by his military intelligence background and his position within Millbrook's financial community. Hayes understood that successful real estate transactions involving former military property typically required extensive legal preparation, environmental assessments, and political coordination that could take months or years to complete satisfactorily. Marcus's ability to navigate these complexities with apparent ease suggested either extraordinary competence in dealing with federal bureaucracy or access to information and assistance that was not available to civilian buyers. Hayes's security clearance from his National Guard service provided him with enough knowledge of classified military operations to recognize when standard explanations didn't adequately account for observed phenomena. The timing of Marcus's purchase was particularly suspicious to Hayes, who had noticed that it coincided with renewed federal interest in Fort Mitchell that was reflected in increased helicopter overflights, visits from unmarked government vehicles, and inquiries from federal contractors about the availability of temporary office space in Millbrook. The pattern suggested that Marcus's acquisition of the property was connected to broader government activities that were being carefully concealed from public scrutiny. Hayes's banking experience had taught him to recognize the financial signatures of different types of large-scale operations, from legitimate business ventures to money laundering schemes to covert government funding mechanisms. Marcus's financial profile contained elements that were consistent with someone who had received compensation from classified government programs, compensation that would not appear in standard credit reports or tax documentation but would provide access to substantial financial resources that could be deployed without conventional oversight. The $2.3 million that Marcus had paid for Fort Mitchell represented exactly the kind of untraceable financial transaction that intelligence agencies used to fund operations that could not be officially acknowledged or publicly defended. The money had been transferred from accounts that were nominally personal, but possessed characteristics that suggested government backing, including wire transfer protocols that bypassed standard banking security measures and clearance procedures that indicated federal approval at the highest levels. Marcus's apparent isolation from Millbrook's social and business communities was actually a carefully maintained cover that allowed him to conduct surveillance and intelligence-gathering operations without attracting attention from local residents who might otherwise question his activities. His routine visits to local businesses provided opportunities to assess potential security threats, monitor communications networks, and gather intelligence about federal interest in the Fort Mitchell property. The hardware store supplies that Marcus purchased were not intended for basic property maintenance, but for sophisticated electronic surveillance installations that would allow him to monitor federal activities around Fort Mitchell while maintaining secure communications with intelligence contacts who were providing support for his mission. His tools included frequency scanners, capable of intercepting encrypted government communications, ground-penetrating radar equipment that could map underground installations, and computer systems designed to access classified databases that contained information about Fort Mitchell's true operational history. Elena Rodriguez had understood her husband's connection to Fort Mitchell better than anyone else in his life, including his daughter Isabella. During their marriage, she had served as his confidential research assistant, helping him organize classified documents, analyze technical specifications, and maintain secure files that documented evidence of ongoing government activities at the supposedly abandoned base. Elena's death in what had been officially classified as a traffic accident had occurred just 3 days after she had told Marcus that she had discovered connections between Fort Mitchell and a network of underground facilities that extended throughout the region. Her research had suggested that the base closure had been a cover story designed to conceal the expansion of classified operations that were too sensitive to be conducted at officially acknowledged military installations. The timing of Elena's death had convinced Marcus that her research had attracted the attention of government agencies that were willing to use lethal force to protect Fort Mitchell's secrets. Her funeral had been attended by federal officials who claimed to be there out of respect for Marcus's military service, but whose presence had seemed more consistent with intelligence assessment than genuine condolence. The silver compass that Elena had given Marcus contained more than sentimental value or encrypted data storage capabilities. The device was actually a sophisticated navigation system that had been designed for special operations, personnel who needed to locate classified installations that were deliberately hidden from standard mapping and GPS systems. Elena had obtained the compass through connections to federal contractors who specialized in providing equipment for covert operations that required the highest levels of security and technological sophistication. Marcus's decision to purchase Fort Mitchell represented more than an attempt to honor his wife's memory or satisfy his own curiosity about his military service. The acquisition was actually the culmination of a 23-year intelligence operation designed to expose government activities that were illegal, unconstitutional, and potentially treasonous in their scope and implications. The $400 million in government secrets that lay buried beneath Fort Mitchell's seemingly worthless surface represented evidence of criminal activities that extended to the highest levels of federal government, activities that included the deliberate concealment of technological discoveries, the unauthorized detention of American citizens, and the systematic elimination of military personnel who possessed knowledge of classified operations that violated both domestic and international law. Marcus Rodriguez was not a financially irresponsible veteran chasing military nostalgia, but a highly trained intelligence operative who had spent more than 2 decades preparing to expose the truth about Fort Mitchell, regardless of the personal cost or professional consequences. His purchase of the property was the beginning of the most important mission of his life, a mission that would either vindicate 23 years of careful planning or result in his death at the hands of the same government agencies that had already eliminated his wife and countless other Americans who had discovered too much about activities that were supposed to remain secret forever. The quiet man who absorbed mockery without response was actually one of the most dangerous threats that certain federal agencies had ever faced, a threat that possessed the legal authority, technical knowledge, and moral conviction necessary to expose secrets that had been protected by multiple presidential administrations and countless government officials who had chosen institutional loyalty over constitutional duty. The story of Marcus Rodriguez began not in the dusty town halls of Millbrook, but in the scorching desert training facilities of Camp Pendleton, where 18-year-old Marcus had arrived with dreams of serving his country and a naive belief that military service meant following orders without questioning their purpose or consequences. His drill instructors had recognized something exceptional in the quiet kid from Phoenix, something that went beyond physical strength or tactical intelligence to encompass the kind of unshakable moral foundation that special operations commanders valued above all other qualities. Marcus's grandfather, Sergeant First Class Antonio Rodriguez, had served with distinction in the Pacific Theater during World War II, island hopping from Guadalcanal to Okinawa with the kind of courage that earned Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts, but never received the recognition it deserved. Antonio's war stories had shaped Marcus's understanding of duty and sacrifice, but they had also instilled a deep skepticism about official military narratives that often bore little resemblance to the reality experienced by the men who actually fought America's battles. The antique silver compass that would later become Marcus's most treasured possession had originally belonged to Antonio, who had used it to navigate through Pacific jungles where standard maps were useless and GPS technology was still decades away from invention. Antonio had modified the compass during his service, adding hidden compartments and secret markings that allowed him to store intelligence information and coordinate with resistance fighters who were operating behind enemy lines. When Antonio passed away during Marcus's junior year of high school, he left behind more than family memories and military decorations. Hidden in his garage workshop, carefully concealed beneath decades of accumulated tools and automotive parts, Antonio had maintained a comprehensive archive of classified military documents, photographs, and technical specifications that documented government activities that were never supposed to be revealed to civilian populations. The documents revealed that Antonio's World War II service had continued long after the official end of hostilities, involving participation in classified operations throughout the Secre Pacific region that were designed to secure strategic resources and establish intelligence networks that would serve American interests during the emerging Cold War. Antonio's real military specialty had not been infantry combat, but signals intelligence and covert reconnaissance, skills that had made him invaluable to military commanders who needed information about enemy capabilities and intentions that could not be obtained through conventional means. Marcus had spent his final months of high school studying his grandfather's hidden archive, trying to understand the implications of documents that described military operations involving technologies and capabilities that seemed decades ahead of their time. The files contained references to underground installations, advanced communication systems, and weapons development programs that were being conducted at locations that did not appear on any official military maps or organizational charts. One file had been particularly significant: a detailed technical assessment of a facility designated as Installation Mitchell 7, located in what would later become Fort Mitchell. The assessment described underground construction projects that had begun during World War II and continued throughout the 1950s and 1960s, creating a network of tunnels, laboratories, and storage facilities that extended more than 300 feet below ground level. The installation had been designed to serve multiple functions simultaneously: as a secure storage facility for classified weapons and technological prototypes, as a research center for projects that were too sensitive to be conducted at officially acknowledged military bases, and as a command center for intelligence operations that required complete isolation from standard military command structures. The project had been funded through black budget allocations that were hidden within legitimate defense spending, making it virtually impossible for congressional oversight committees to track or audit its activities. Marcus's decision to enlist in the Marines had been motivated not just by patriotic duty, but by a determination to understand the truth about military operations like Installation Mitchell 7 that existed in the shadows of America's official defense establishment. He had hoped that military service would provide access to classified information that would help him understand his grandfather's involvement in covert operations and the broader implications of government activities that were being concealed. From the American people, Marine Corps' boot camp had been followed by advanced training in military intelligence and reconnaissance, specialties that required extensive background investigations and security clearances that provided access to information that most military personnel never saw. Marcus's instructors had been impressed by his analytical capabilities and his ability to maintain operational security even under extreme stress, qualities that made him an ideal candidate for assignment to classified operations that required absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty. His first assignment after advanced training had been to Marine Force Reconnaissance, an elite unit that conducted deep reconnaissance missions in hostile territory where detection meant certain death, and mission failure could compromise national security interests. The training was brutal and comprehensive, covering everything from advanced weapon systems to psychological warfare, techniques to survival methods that allowed operators to remain hidden in enemy territory for weeks or months at a time. But Marcus's real education had begun when he was selected for temporary assignment to a classified unit that operated under the designation Reconnaissance Team Bravo 7. The team's official mission was to conduct intelligence gathering operations at sensitive military installations throughout the United States, ostensibly to test security procedures and identify vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile intelligence services. The reality was far more complex and disturbing. Reconnaissance Team Bravo 7 was actually tasked with monitoring classified military projects that were being conducted without proper authorization or oversight, projects that involved technologies and capabilities that could fundamentally alter the balance of global military power. The team's real mission was to ensure that these projects remained under the control of specific government agencies and did not fall into the hands of unauthorized personnel who might reveal their existence to congressional investigators or foreign intelligence services. Marcus's first assignment with Reconnaissance Team Bravo 7 had been to Fort Mitchell, which was officially designated as a standard military training facility but actually served as the cover for Installation Mitchell 7, the underground complex that his grandfather had helped to document decades earlier. The base's surface facilities were maintained at minimal operational levels, with just enough activity to justify its continued existence without attracting attention from military auditors or congressional oversight committees. The real activity at Fort Mitchell took place underground, in laboratories and storage facilities that had been expanded continuously since World War II to accommodate projects that were becoming increasingly sophisticated and potentially dangerous. Marcus's reconnaissance mission was supposed to last 30 days, during which he would document security procedures, assess personnel reliability, and identify any potential threats to operational security that needed to be addressed. What he discovered during those 30 days challenged everything he thought he understood about his military service and his country's government. Installation Mitchell 7 was not just a research facility or weapons storage depot, but the command center for a network of similar installations throughout the United States that were conducting projects involving technologies that were decades ahead of anything that existed in the public sector. The underground complex contained laboratories where scientists were working on propulsion systems that defied conventional understanding of physics, communication devices that could maintain contact across interstellar distances, and weapon systems that could neutralize entire military forces without causing detectable environmental damage. The projects were being funded through a combination of black budget allocations and revenue from technologies that were being sold to foreign governments without the knowledge or approval of Congress. More disturbing than the technological capabilities being developed at Installation Mitchell 7 was the evidence Marcus discovered of systematic elimination of military personnel who had gained unauthorized knowledge of the facility's activities. His grandfather's files had documented dozens of cases where military personnel had died in accidents or disappeared entirely after being assigned to projects at Installation Mitchell 7. Deaths that followed patterns suggesting deliberate assassination. Rather than random misfortune, the personnel files that Marcus accessed during his reconnaissance mission contained similar patterns extending into the 1980s and 1990s, indicating that the elimination of security risks was an ongoing operational priority that took precedence over the lives and welfare of military personnel who had sworn oaths to serve their country with honor and integrity. The files suggested that Installation Mitchell 7 was operating under the authority of government agencies that considered themselves above the law and beyond the reach of constitutional oversight. Marcus's psychological profile had been carefully assessed before his assignment to Reconnaissance Team Bravo 7, and his commanders had correctly identified him as someone who possessed the moral flexibility necessary to compartmentalize disturbing information without allowing it to interfere with mission completion. But they had underestimated the depth of his commitment to constitutional principles and his unwillingness to participate in activities that he considered fundamentally treasonous. Instead of simply documenting security procedures and submitting routine reports, Marcus had used his access to Installation Mitchell 7 to gather evidence of illegal activities that could be used to expose the entire network of unauthorized government operations. He had photographed classified documents, copied computer files, and recorded conversations that provided irrefutable proof of government activities that violated both domestic and international law. The evidence Marcus gathered revealed that Installation Mitchell 7 was connected to similar facilities throughout the world, facilities that were being used to develop technologies that were being withheld from the American people while being sold to foreign governments for prices that generated billions of dollars in unauthorized revenue. The money was being used to fund additional classified projects that operated without congressional authorization or executive oversight, creating a shadow government that was accountable to no one except the small group of officials who controlled its activities. Marcus's wife Elena had been a graduate student in computer science at Arizona State University when they met during his leave between deployments, but her academic background concealed capabilities that were far more sophisticated than her university credentials suggested. Elena possessed advanced degrees in cryptography and information systems from institutions that conducted classified research for government agencies, credentials that required security clearances and background investigations that were normally reserved for intelligence professionals. Elena had recognized the significance of the evidence that Marcus had gathered at Installation Mitchell 7, and she had used her technical expertise to help him organize and preserve the information in formats that could withstand government attempts to suppress or destroy it. Together, they had created multiple backup copies of the evidence, stored in locations and formats that would ensure its survival, even if they were eliminated by the same agencies that had killed Marcus's grandfather and countless other military personnel. The compass that Elena had given Marcus as a wedding gift was actually a sophisticated data storage and navigation device that contained complete copies of all the evidence they had gathered about Installation Mitchell 7 and related facilities. The device had been designed to appear like an ordinary antique compass, while actually incorporating advanced electronics that could store terabytes of information and provide precise navigation to classified installations that were deliberately excluded from standard mapping systems. Elena's murder had been carefully planned and executed to appear like a random traffic accident, but Marcus's investigation had revealed evidence of deliberate sabotage that indicated government involvement at the highest levels. The timing of her death, just days after she had told him about connections between Installation Mitchell 7 and other classified facilities, had convinced him that their research had been discovered by agencies that were willing to use lethal force to protect their secrets. Marcus's decision to purchase Fort Mitchell represented the culmination of more than 20 years of careful planning and preparation, 20 years during which he had used his military training and intelligence Contacts to develop the capabilities necessary to expose the truth about Installation Mitchell 7, regardless of the personal consequences. His acquisition of the property provided him with legal authority to access underground facilities that had been sealed since the base's official closure, facilities that contained evidence that could finally bring justice to the thousands of Americans who had been killed to protect government secrets. The $2.3 million purchase price had been provided through a network of intelligence contacts who shared Marcus's commitment to constitutional government and his determination to expose illegal activities that were being conducted by agencies that had forgotten their obligation to serve the American people rather than their own institutional interests. The money represented contributions from military personnel, intelligence officials, and government contractors who possessed evidence of similar illegal activities at other installations, but lacked the authority or capability to expose them. Without risking their own lives, Marcus Rodriguez was not just a retired Marine seeking closure about his military service, but the leader of a nationwide network of government employees and military personnel who were committed to exposing the shadow government that had been operating without authorization or oversight for more than 70 years. His purchase of Fort Mitchell was the beginning of the most important intelligence operation in American history, an operation that would either restore constitutional government or result in the elimination of everyone who threatened the continued existence of Installation Mitchell 7 and its network of classified facilities. The harassment began 3 days after Marcus officially took possession of the Fort Mitchell property, starting with seemingly innocent incidents that could easily be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck by anyone who didn't understand the sophisticated methods that intelligence agencies use to intimidate targets without leaving evidence of deliberate action. His mail delivery became erratic, with important documents arriving weeks late or disappearing entirely, forcing him to rely on electronic communications that he knew were being monitored by federal agencies with unlimited surveillance capabilities. Local building inspectors arrived at the property without advance notice, claiming to have received anonymous complaints about safety violations and environmental hazards that required immediate investigation and expensive remediation. The inspectors carried credentials that appeared legitimate, but their questions focused more on Marcus's plans for underground excavation than on standard building code compliance, suggesting that their real purpose was intelligence gathering rather than public safety protection. Richard Blackstone's campaign against Marcus's credibility intensified as news of the property purchase spread throughout the regional business community, generating the kind of negative publicity that could make future development projects impossible to finance or permit through normal regulatory channels. Blackstone used his connections with local media outlets to plant stories that portrayed Marcus as a mentally unstable veteran whose financial irresponsibility posed potential risks to Millbrook's economic development and property values. The stories were carefully crafted to avoid legal liability while maximizing damage to Marcus's reputation, featuring anonymous quotes from concerned citizens who expressed worry about having an unpredictable veteran as a neighbor, and financial experts who questioned the wisdom of allowing someone with obvious judgment problems to own such a large and potentially dangerous property. The articles never directly stated that Marcus was mentally ill or financially incompetent, but they created clear implications that most readers would interpret as expert confirmation of their own prejudices about veterans and military spending. Blackstone's motivations extended beyond simple business competition or wounded pride over his failed acquisition of the Fort Mitchell property. His development company had received inquiries from federal contractors who were willing to pay substantial premiums for discreet access to the property, access that would allow them to conduct environmental assessments and archaeological surveys that required no oversight or public disclosure of their findings. The contractors had been careful never to explicitly state what they expected to find at Fort Mitchell or why their activities required such extraordinary secrecy, but Blackstone's experience with government contracts had taught him to recognize the financial signatures of classified operations. The premium payments being offered for access to the property were consistent with intelligence operations that required immediate results regardless of cost, suggesting that Fort Mitchell contained something valuable enough to justify expenditures that would normally require congressional authorization. Blackstone's harassment campaign was being coordinated with federal agencies through intermediaries who maintained plausible deniability, while ensuring that Marcus faced constant pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Local police received anonymous reports of suspicious activities at the Fort Mitchell property that required investigation, forcing Marcus to explain his presence and activities to officers who were instructed to document everything he said for inclusion in federal databases. Zoning board officials discovered previously overlooked regulations that prohibited certain types of activities on former military property, regulations that required expensive legal challenges and environmental assessments that could delay any development projects for years. Bank officials received inquiries about Marcus's financial stability and creditworthiness from federal agencies that claimed to be conducting routine security investigations, but were actually gathering information that could be used to freeze his assets or foreclose on the property. The pattern of harassment was sophisticated enough to avoid obvious legal violations, while creating the kind of sustained pressure that had driven previous targets to abandon their activities or make mistakes. That provided justification for more direct government intervention. Marcus recognized the tactics from his intelligence training, but his military experience had also taught him that effective resistance required patience, careful documentation, and strategic planning rather than emotional reactions that could be used to justify escalated harassment. David Hayes observed the systematic campaign against Marcus with growing alarm that was informed by his military intelligence background and his position within Millbrook's financial community. Hayes understood that the level of coordination being demonstrated by various government agencies and private contractors indicated federal involvement that extended far beyond routine property disputes or local zoning conflicts. The timing and sophistication of the harassment suggested that Marcus's purchase of Fort Mitchell had triggered automated alert systems within multiple federal agencies, systems that were designed to protect classified installations and operations from unauthorized investigation or exposure. Hayes's security clearance from his National Guard service provided him with enough knowledge of intelligence operations to recognize when standard explanations were being used to conceal activities that violated constitutional limitations on government surveillance and harassment of American citizens. Hayes's banking experience had exposed him to the financial signatures of various types of covert operations, from legitimate intelligence gathering to illegal domestic surveillance. Programs that were funded through black budget allocations and concealed within routine government expenditures. The money being spent on the harassment campaign against Marcus was consistent with high-priority intelligence operations that had been authorized at the highest levels of government and were being conducted without regard for legal or constitutional constraints. The federal agencies coordinating the harassment campaign possessed surveillance capabilities that extended far beyond anything that most Americans realized was possible or legal. Capabilities that included real-time monitoring of all electronic communications, comprehensive tracking of financial transactions, and physical surveillance that could document every movement and conversation without detection by the target or casual observers. Marcus's phone calls were being intercepted and analyzed by sophisticated computer systems that could identify keywords, voice patterns, and background sounds that provided intelligence about his activities, contacts, and intentions. His internet usage was being monitored through programs that could access his computer remotely and document every website visited, every email sent, and every file downloaded or transmitted to other parties. His financial transactions were being tracked through banking systems that provided federal agencies with real-time information about every purchase, every payment, and every financial transfer that could reveal information about his resources, capabilities, and operational planning. Even cash transactions were being monitored through surveillance cameras and electronic tracking systems that made truly anonymous financial activity virtually impossible in modern American society. The harassment campaign was designed not just to pressure Marcus into abandoning his activities at Fort Mitchell, but to gather intelligence about his capabilities, resources, and intentions that would allow federal agencies to develop more effective countermeasures if the harassment proved insufficient to neutralize the threat he represented. Every response Marcus made to the harassment provided additional information about his training, his contacts, and his operational methods that could be used to predict and prevent his future activities. Marcus's daughter, Isabella, possessed security clearances that provided her with access to classified information about domestic intelligence operations. But her position as a federal prosecutor also created professional obligations that prevented her from directly assisting her father's activities without risking her career and potentially violating federal laws regarding the disclosure of classified information to unauthorized personnel. Isabella's prosecutorial experience had exposed her to evidence of government activities that violated constitutional limitations on domestic surveillance and harassment. But her attempts to investigate or prosecute these violations had been blocked by Justice Department officials who claimed that national security considerations took precedence over constitutional protections for American citizens. The case is that Isabella had been prevented from pursuing involved patterns of government harassment that were virtually identical to what she was observing in her father's situation, patterns that suggested the existence of systematic programs designed to neutralize American citizens who posed threats to classified government operations. Her security clearance provided her with enough knowledge of these programs to understand that her father was facing dangers that extended far beyond financial harassment or bureaucratic obstruction. Isabella's professional position created a conflict of interest that prevented her from providing direct assistance to her father while also giving her access to information that confirmed the legitimacy of his concerns about Fort Mitchell and the classified activities that were being concealed there. Her prosecutorial experience had taught her that government agencies were willing to use lethal force to protect classified operations from exposure, and her mother's death had provided personal confirmation that these agencies considered no American citizen to be beyond their reach. The sophisticated surveillance and harassment campaign being conducted against Marcus required coordination between multiple federal agencies and private contractors, coordination that indicated the existence of standing authorities and operational procedures for dealing with threats to classified installations and operations. The level of resources being devoted to the campaign suggested that Fort Mitchell contained information or capabilities that were considered vital to national security interests. Regardless of their legal or constitutional status, Marcus's military training had prepared him for exactly this type of sustained harassment campaign, and his intelligence experience had taught him to recognize the difference between amateur intimidation and professional psychological warfare operations. He understood that his responses to the harassment were being carefully monitored and analyzed for signs of weakness, desperation, or tactical errors that could be exploited to force him into making mistakes that would provide justification for more direct government intervention. Instead of reacting emotionally to the harassment, Marcus implemented countermeasures that were designed to document the illegal activities being conducted against him while protecting his ability to continue his mission at Fort Mitchell. He installed sophisticated surveillance equipment throughout his property that could detect and record electronic monitoring activities, and he established secure communication channels with intelligence contacts who could provide early warning of escalated government action against him. Marcus's evening routine included comprehensive security sweeps of his property that were designed to detect surveillance equipment, intrusion attempts, and other indicators of hostile intelligence activities. His military training had taught him that effective counterintelligence required constant vigilance and systematic documentation of all suspicious activities, regardless of how innocent they might appear to casual observers. The pressure from the harassment campaign was taking its toll on Marcus's physical and psychological health, but his military experience had taught him that successful completion of difficult missions required the ability to function effectively despite sustained stress and constant threats. He understood that the harassment was designed to force him into making hasty decisions or emotional reactions that would compromise his mission and provide his enemies with opportunities to neutralize the threat he represented. Marcus's nights were filled with memories of his service at installation Mitchell 7 and the evidence he had gathered about illegal government activities that were being conducted in violation of constitutional limitations on federal authority. The harassment campaign was confirmation that his evidence was accurate and that federal agencies were willing to violate the constitutional rights of American citizens to protect their classified operations from exposure. The silver compass that Alina had given him provided both navigation assistance and secure data storage capabilities, but it also served as a reminder of his wife's sacrifice and his obligation to honor her memory by completing the mission that had cost her life. The compass seemed to pulse with significance in the darkness of his bedroom, its silver surface reflecting moonlight that reminded him of the underground installations where America's shadow government was conducting activities that were too illegal and unconstitutional to be conducted in the light of public scrutiny. Marcus understood that the harassment campaign was only the beginning of the government's response to his activities at Fort Mitchell, and that escalation to more direct and potentially lethal countermeasures was inevitable if he continued to pose a threat to classified operations. But his military training had taught him that successful completion of important missions required the willingness to accept personal risks that civilians would consider unacceptable, and his intelligence experience had prepared him for exactly the kind of shadow war that he was now fighting against agencies that had forgotten their obligation to serve the American people rather than their own institutional interests. The harassment campaign was also providing Marcus with valuable intelligence about the capabilities and limitations of the federal agencies that were targeting him. Intelligence that would be essential for the success of his ultimate mission to expose the truth about Installation Mitchell 7 and the network of classified facilities that were operating without constitutional authorization or congressional oversight throughout the United States. The breaking point arrived on a humid Tuesday morning when Marcus discovered that someone had tampered with the main electrical systems at Fort Mitchell during the night, cutting power lines in a pattern that suggested professional sabotage rather than random vandalism or equipment failure. The damage was sophisticated enough to require specialized knowledge of military electrical systems, but crude enough to appear like the work of local vandals who had decided to harass the controversial new property owner. Marcus's inspection of the damage revealed clear evidence of government-grade cutting tools and techniques that were designed to disable security systems while creating plausible deniability for the agencies responsible for the sabotage. The electrical cuts had been made at precisely the locations that would disable the surveillance equipment he had installed to monitor underground access points, suggesting that whoever had conducted the sabotage possessed detailed knowledge of his security arrangements and operational capabilities. The timing of the sabotage coincided with increased helicopter activity over the Fort Mitchell property, flights that followed patterns consistent with intelligence gathering operations rather than routine military training exercises. The helicopters maintained altitudes and flight paths that allowed their occupants to conduct detailed surveillance of the property while remaining high enough to avoid clear identification by ground-based observers. Richard Blackstone had escalated his campaign against Marcus to include direct interference with utility services and municipal permits that were essential for any serious development work at the Fort Mitchell property. Through his connections with local government officials, Blackstone had arranged for water and sewer services to be disconnected due to alleged safety violations that required expensive remediation before service could be restored. The violations, cited by municipal officials, were based on environmental assessments that had been conducted without Marcus's knowledge or permission. Assessments that claimed to have detected contamination levels that posed immediate threats to public health and safety. The assessment reports contained technical language and regulatory citations that appeared legitimate, but closer examination revealed inconsistencies and impossibilities that suggested the documents had been fabricated specifically to justify the service disconnections. Blackstone's motivation for this escalated. Harassment went beyond simple business competition or wounded pride over his failed acquisition of the property. Federal contractors had increased their offers for discreet access to Fort Mitchell to levels that indicated the property contained something far more valuable than anything that conventional real estate development could provide. The contractors had begun making direct contact with Blackstone through intermediaries who possessed federal credentials and spoke with the kind of authority that suggested high-level government backing for their activities. The conversations were carefully structured to avoid explicit statements about illegal activities, but the implications were clear enough to convince Blackstone that cooperation with federal agencies would be far more profitable than continued competition with Marcus for control of the property. Blackstone's development company had received preliminary contracts worth more than $50 million for providing logistical support and security services for unspecified government activities at Fort Mitchell. Contracts that required no competitive bidding and included secrecy clauses that prohibited disclosure of any information about the nature or scope of the work being performed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The contracts represented more money than Blackstone's company had earned in the previous 5 years combined, and they came with guarantees of additional work at similar facilities throughout the region if the Fort Mitchell project was completed successfully and discreetly. The financial incentives were structured to ensure Blackstone's complete cooperation with federal agencies, while providing legal protection for activities that might otherwise be considered criminal harassment or interference with private property rights. Federal agencies had begun using Blackstone's harassment campaign as cover for more sophisticated intelligence operations, designed to gather detailed information about Marcus's capabilities, resources, and operational planning. Electronic surveillance equipment had been installed in municipal buildings and private businesses throughout Millbrook, equipment that could monitor Marcus's communications and movements without requiring access to his property or personal devices. Surveillance network was comprehensive enough to track every phone call Marcus made, every person he met with, and every location he visited within a 50-mile radius of Fort Mitchell. The information was being transmitted to federal databases through encrypted communication channels that were designed to be undetectable by standard counterintelligence methods. David Hayes had begun conducting his own investigation into the counterintelligence methods harassment campaign against Marcus, using his banking connections and military intelligence background to gather information about the federal agencies and private contractors that were coordinating the activities. Hayes's security clearance provided him with access to classified databases that contained information about domestic intelligence operations, but his inquiries had begun triggering automated alert systems that indicated his activities were being monitored by the same agencies that were targeting Marcus. Hayes's investigation had revealed that the harassment campaign against Marcus was part of a broader program designed to protect classified installations and operations from unauthorized investigation or exposure by American citizens who possessed the knowledge and capabilities necessary to threaten national security interests. The program operated under special authorities that had been granted during national security emergencies, but had never been rescinded, creating a legal framework that allowed federal agencies to conduct domestic operations that would normally be prohibited by constitutional limitations on government power. The financial resources being devoted to the harassment campaign indicated that Fort Mitchell was considered a high-priority target that justified expenditures normally reserved for foreign intelligence operations or counterterrorism activities. The level of coordination between federal agencies suggested that the protection of Fort Mitchell's secrets had been designated as a matter of vital national security that took precedence over constitutional protections for American citizens. Hayes's banking experience had exposed him to the financial signatures of various types of government operations, and the money flows associated with the Marcus harassment campaign were consistent with the most sensitive and highly classified intelligence programs. The funding sources included black budget allocations that were hidden within routine government expenditures and private contractor payments that were designed to provide plausible deniability for government activities that violated domestic law. Isabella Rodriguez Chun had begun using her prosecutorial authority to investigate the harassment campaign against her father, but her inquiries had been blocked by Justice Department officials who claimed that national security considerations prevented disclosure of information that might compromise ongoing intelligence operations. The obstructionism was more sophisticated than simple bureaucratic delay, involving the classification of routine law enforcement information and the invocation of executive privilege to prevent congressional oversight of domestic intelligence activities. Isabella's prosecutorial experience had taught her to recognize the difference between legitimate national security protections and illegal government activities that were being concealed through abuse of classification authorities. The pattern of obstruction she was encountering was consistent with systematic violations of constitutional law that were being protected by government officials who had forgotten their oath to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Her security clearance provided her with access to classified information about domestic intelligence programs, but the information she was able to access confirmed that her father was facing threats that extended far beyond bureaucratic harassment or local political opposition. The agencies targeting Marcus possessed capabilities and authorities that were normally reserved for dealing with foreign intelligence threats, capabilities that included lethal force authorization for situations where other methods proved insufficient. To neutralize security risks, Isabella's professional position as a federal prosecutor created ethical obligations that prevented her from directly assisting her father's activities, but it also provided her with legal authorities that could be used to investigate and potentially prosecute the illegal activities being conducted against him. Her challenge was gathering evidence of criminal violations while protecting her father from escalated government action that could result in his death or disappearance. The harassment campaign had begun affecting other residents of Millbrook who were associated with Marcus or who had expressed his support for his property rights, creating a climate of fear and intimidation that was designed to isolate him from potential allies or sources of assistance. Local business owners who had provided services to Marcus found themselves subject to unexpected tax audits, regulatory inspections, and permit reviews that created financial pressures and legal complications. Citizens who had spoken publicly in support of Marcus's property rights received visits from federal agents who claimed to be conducting routine security investigations, but asked questions that were clearly designed to intimidate and discourage further expressions of support. The visits were conducted with the kind of professional courtesy that made formal complaints difficult while creating clear implications about the consequences of continued association with someone who was considered a security threat. The intimidation campaign was sophisticated enough to avoid obvious legal violations while creating the kind of community pressure that had proven effective in previous operations designed to isolate and neutralize domestic security threats. Most residents of Millbrook lacked the legal knowledge or financial resources necessary to resist federal intimidation, making them vulnerable to pressure tactics that were designed to turn the entire community against Marcus. Marcus had begun detecting evidence of more sophisticated surveillance and intelligence, gathering activities that indicated the harassment campaign was being expanded to include preparation for direct action against him if other methods proved insufficient to neutralize the threat he represented. Electronic surveillance equipment had been installed throughout his property without his knowledge, equipment that was designed to monitor his activities while providing real-time intelligence to federal agencies about his capabilities and operational planning. The surveillance equipment was military-grade technology that was normally used for foreign intelligence operations, equipment that could monitor conversations, track movements, and detect weapons or explosive devices from considerable distances. The installation of such sophisticated equipment indicated that federal agencies were preparing for the possibility that Marcus possessed military capabilities that could pose serious threats to government personnel if he decided to resist more direct forms of intervention. Marcus's military training had taught him to recognize the escalation patterns that preceded direct action against high-value targets, and his intelligence experience had prepared him to implement countermeasures that could provide early warning of government plans to neutralize him through arrest, detention, or elimination. He understood that the harassment campaign was entering its final phase and that he had limited time to complete his mission before federal agencies escalated to methods that would make further resistance impossible. The silver compass that Elena had given him contained not only encrypted data about Installation Mitchell 7, but also communication protocols that would allow him to contact intelligence networks that were committed to exposing illegal government activities regardless of the personal costs involved. The compass was actually a sophisticated communication device that could transmit encrypted messages to receivers located throughout the United States. Receivers that were operated by military personnel and intelligence officials who shared Marcus's commitment to constitutional government. Marcus's decision to activate these communication protocols represented a point of no return that would either result in the successful exposure of Installation Mitchell 7 and its network of classified facilities, or in his elimination by the ECO 7 and its network of classified facilities, or in his elimination by the falsified facilities. Same agencies that had killed his wife and countless other Americans who had discovered too much about activities that were supposed to remain secret forever. The harassment campaign had served its purpose of confirming that Fort Mitchell contains secrets valuable enough to justify the violation of constitutional rights and the systematic intimidation of American citizens, but it had also provided Marcus with intelligence about federal capabilities and intentions that would be essential for the success of his ultimate mission to restore constitutional government and bring justice to those who had died protecting America's most dangerous secrets. The time for patience and strategic planning was rapidly coming to an end, and Marcus understood that the next phase of his conflict with the shadow government would require him to use all of his military training and intelligence experience to survive long enough to complete the most important mission of his life. The moment of truth arrived at 3:47 a.m. on a moonless Thursday when Marcus detected unauthorized movement in the underground access tunnels that connected Fort Mitchell's surface facilities to Installation Mitchell 7. His sophisticated surveillance equipment had registered thermal signatures and electromagnetic anomalies that indicated multiple personnel were conducting covert operations in areas that were supposed to be permanently sealed and abandoned. Marcus had been expecting this escalation for weeks, understanding that federal agencies would eventually move beyond harassment and intimidation to direct action designed to secure or destroy evidence that could expose the truth about Installation Mitchell 7. His military training had taught him that successful defense of strategic positions required immediate response to incursions, but his intelligence experience warned him that premature action could compromise his ultimate mission to expose government secrets that had been protected by decades of systematic deception. The intruders were using professional-grade equipment that suggested military or intelligence agency backing, equipment that included ground-penetrating radar systems capable of mapping underground installations, electromagnetic pulse devices that could disable electronic security systems, and communication gear that operated on encrypted frequencies normally reserved for classified government operations. The sophistication of their equipment indicated that this was not a random break-in or casual trespassing, but a carefully planned intelligence operation designed to assess or neutralize whatever secrets lay buried beneath Fort Mitchell. Marcus's response to the incursion demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond anything that his official military records would have suggested possible. Moving through the darkness with tactical precision that spoke of extensive special operations training, he navigated underground passages that were not included in any official blueprints or architectural plans, passages that his grandfather, Antonio, had helped to construct during the classified expansion of Installation Mitchell 7 in the 1950s. The passages had been designed as escape routes and emergency access points for classified operations that required complete isolation from standard military command structures, and they contained hidden chambers where sensitive equipment and documentation had been stored for decades, without detection by official military inspectors or congressional oversight committees. Marcus's knowledge of these hidden areas represented intelligence that was literally priceless to federal agencies that had spent billions of dollars trying to locate and secure all evidence of Installation Mitchell 7's activities. As Marcus moved through the underground complex, his grandfather's modified compass provided navigation assistance that was impossible to replicate using standard military equipment. The compass had been programmed with the precise locations of Installation Mitchell 7's most sensitive areas, including laboratories where classified research had been conducted, storage facilities where experimental weapons had been tested, and command centers where intelligence operations had been coordinated, without authorization from officially acknowledged government agencies. The intruders had divided into 3 teams that were simultaneously conducting operations in different sections of the underground complex, indicating a level of tactical coordination that suggested extensive advanced planning and detailed intelligence about the facility's layout and security systems. The teams were communicating using encrypted radio frequencies that were being monitored and jammed by Marcus's electronic warfare equipment that he had acquired through intelligence contacts who shared his commitment to exposing illegal government activities. Marcus's countermeasures against the intruders demonstrated technical capabilities that were decades ahead of anything that conventional military training would have provided. Using advanced surveillance systems that could track personnel through concrete walls and steel barriers, he monitored the intruders' movements while remaining completely invisible to their detection equipment, a capability that suggested access to classified technologies that were not available to standard military or law enforcement personnel. The first team of intruders was conducting systematic searches of areas that contained evidence of weapons development programs that had violated international treaties and domestic laws regarding the development and testing of prohibited weapons systems. The weapons programs had been funded through black budget allocations that were hidden within legitimate defense contracts, and they had produced prototypes that were decades ahead of anything that existed in the public sector or in the arsenals of foreign governments. Marcus had documented these weapons programs during his original reconnaissance mission at Installation Mitchell 7, and his evidence included photographs, technical specifications, and financial records that proved the existence of government activities that were illegal under both domestic and international law. The weapons programs represented violations of constitutional limitations on government authority that were so serious that their disclosure could result in criminal prosecutions that extended to the highest levels of federal government. The second team was focusing on areas that contained evidence of unauthorized detention and interrogation facilities where American citizens had been held without due process, without access to legal representation, and without notification to family members or civilian authorities. The detention facilities had been used to hold military personnel, government contractors, and civilian researchers who had discovered evidence of illegal activities at installation Mitchell 7 and similar facilities throughout the United States. The detention and interrogation programs represented systematic violations of constitutional rights that were protected by the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 8th Amendments, violations that had been conducted with the knowledge and approval of government officials who had sworn oaths to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Marcus's evidence of these programs included facility blueprints, personnel records, and medical documentation that proved the existence of systematic torture and murder of American citizens. The third team was attempting to access computer systems that contained financial records documenting the funding sources for installation Mitchell 7 and its network of classified facilities, funding that included revenue from the sale of classified technologies to foreign governments without congressional authorization or executive approval. The financial records represented evidence of systematic corruption and treason that extended to the highest levels of government, corruption that had generated billions of dollars in unauthorized revenue that was being used to fund additional illegal activities. Marcus's defense of the computer systems demonstrated cybersecurity capabilities that were impossible to acquire through conventional military or civilian training, capabilities that suggested access to classified programs that were designed to protect the most sensitive government secrets from foreign intelligence services and domestic threats. His countermeasures against the cyber intrusion included defensive algorithms that could trace attacks back to their sources while simultaneously destroying the attacking systems and gathering intelligence about the agencies responsible for the intrusion. The tactical situation that developed in the underground complex represented the kind of asymmetric warfare that Marcus had been trained to conduct during his service with classified special operations units, warfare that required the ability to defeat numerically superior forces through superior knowledge of terrain, advanced technology, and tactical innovation that exploited enemy weaknesses while maximizing friendly advantages. Marcus's advantages included comprehensive knowledge of installation Mitchell 7's layout and systems, access to advanced surveillance and communication equipment, and tactical training that was designed for exactly the kind of underground combat that was now taking place. His disadvantages included isolation from backup and support, limited ammunition and supplies, and the certainty that federal agencies possessed virtually unlimited resources that could be deployed against him if the current operation failed to achieve its objectives. The intruders possessed superior numbers, advanced equipment, and direct support from federal agencies that could provide real-time intelligence and tactical assistance through secure communication networks. Their disadvantages included unfamiliarity with installation Mitchell 7's unique layout and security systems, reliance on equipment that was vulnerable to electronic warfare countermeasures, and tactical doctrine that was designed for surface operations rather than underground combat. In confined spaces, the engagement that followed was unlike anything that had occurred on American soil since the Civil War, representing a direct military confrontation between American citizens and federal agencies over constitutional questions that were fundamental to the nature of democratic government. The tactical details of the engagement were classified at levels that prevented disclosure to congressional oversight committees or civilian courts, but the outcome would determine whether constitutional government would be restored or whether the shadow government would succeed in eliminating the last serious threat to its continued existence. Marcus's tactical approach combined elements of guerrilla warfare, electronic warfare, and psychological operations that were designed to defeat the intruders while gathering intelligence about the federal agencies that had sent them. His objectives included the preservation of evidence that could expose Installation Mitchell 7's activities, the documentation of federal crimes being committed during the intrusion, and the survival of personnel who possessed knowledge that was essential for the restoration of constitutional government. The intruder's tactical approach was based on standard military doctrine for facility clearance operations, doctrine that emphasized overwhelming firepower, rapid movement, and systematic elimination of all resistance. Their objectives included the destruction of evidence that could expose classified government activities, the neutralization of Marcus as a security threat, and the restoration of federal control over Installation Mitchell 7 and its network of classified facilities. The engagement was being monitored by federal agencies through electronic surveillance systems that provided real-time intelligence about tactical developments, while maintaining plausible deniability about government involvement in what would officially be classified as a domestic terrorism incident or criminal trespassing case. The monitoring capabilities included satellite surveillance, electronic intercepts, and communication with the intruder teams that allowed federal agencies to provide tactical assistance while avoiding direct involvement that could create legal liability or congressional oversight requirements. Marcus understood that his survival and the success of his mission depended on his ability to use Installation Mitchell 7's unique characteristics to neutralize the tactical advantages possessed by the intruders while exploiting their unfamiliarity with underground combat in environments that had been specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access by hostile forces. The underground complex had been constructed with defensive features that were designed to channel intruders into predetermined kill zones where they could be eliminated by automated systems or small numbers of defenders with superior knowledge of the facility's layout and capabilities. Marcus's knowledge of these defensive features provided him with tactical advantages that could not be overcome through superior numbers or advanced equipment alone. The outcome of the engagement would determine not only Marcus's survival, but the future of constitutional government in the United States and the fate of thousands of Americans who had been killed to protect government secrets that were too illegal and unconstitutional to be disclosed through normal democratic processes. The silver compass that Elena had given him pulsed with electromagnetic energy that indicated the activation of communication systems that connected Installation Mitchell 7 to similar facilities throughout the United States, systems that were now transmitting Marcus's evidence to intelligence networks that were committed to exposing the shadow government regardless of the personal costs involved. The moment of truth had arrived, and Marcus Rodriguez was no longer just a retired Marine defending his property, but the leader of a constitutional rebellion that would either restore democratic government or die in the darkness of America's most classified installation. The underground complex erupted into chaos as Marcus's countermeasures triggered automated defense systems that had been dormant for decades, systems that his grandfather Antonio had helped install during the classified expansion of Installation Mitchell 7 in the 1950s. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in red warning signals, while klaxon alarms announced security breaches that required immediate containment protocols. Protocols that were designed to protect America's most dangerous secrets from unauthorized disclosure regardless of the cost in human lives. The intruders found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of passages that defied the architectural blueprints they had used for mission planning. Passages that seemed to shift and change configuration through mechanical systems that had been designed to confuse and disorient unauthorized personnel. The walls themselves became weapons as hidden panels opened to reveal automated gun turrets that had been programmed to eliminate any personnel who lacked proper security credentials and authorization codes. Marcus moved through the underground complex with supernatural confidence, using access routes that were not included in any official documentation, routes that required biometric identification systems that recognized genetic markers inherited from his grandfather's participation in Installation Mitchell 7's original construction. The biometric systems had been designed to ensure that only authorized personnel and their descendants could access the facility's most sensitive areas, areas that contained evidence of government activities that were too illegal and unconstitutional to be acknowledged by any official agency. David Hayes received an encrypted communication at his home that activated emergency protocols he had hoped never to use, protocols that required him to implement predetermined security measures designed to protect classified information from unauthorized disclosure. The communication came through channels that were reserved for the most serious national security emergencies, channels that indicated installation Mitchell 7's secrets were in immediate danger of exposure to hostile intelligence services or domestic threats. Hayes's response to the emergency communication demonstrated capabilities that went far beyond his official role as a small-town banker and National Guard Reserve officer. Using sophisticated communication equipment that was hidden in his basement, he established secure contact with intelligence networks that operated outside normal government channels, networks that were committed to protecting constitutional government from enemies both foreign and domestic. The intelligence networks that Hayes contacted included military personnel, government officials, and private contractors who possessed evidence of systematic violations of constitutional law by federal agencies that had forgotten their obligation to serve the American people rather than their own institutional interests. These networks had been monitoring installation Mitchell 7 and similar facilities for decades, waiting for the opportunity to expose illegal activities that were being protected by classification authorities and executive privilege. Hayes's communication triggered a cascade of responses throughout the intelligence community as dormant networks activated emergency protocols that had been prepared for exactly this type of constitutional crisis. Military units that were loyal to constitutional government rather than shadow agencies began moving toward Fort Mitchell, while intelligence officials who possessed evidence of illegal government activities prepared to release classified information that would expose the full scope of the shadow government's activities. Isabella Rodriguez Cheen was conducting a late-night review of classified files in her federal prosecutor's office when automated alert systems notified her that her security clearance was being used to access information about ongoing intelligence operations at installation Mitchell 7. The alerts indicated that her father was involved in activities that posed immediate threats to national security, activities that required emergency response protocols that included lethal force. Authorization. Isabella's prosecutorial training had taught her to recognize the difference between legitimate national security operations and illegal government activities that were being concealed through abusive classification authorities. The intelligence reports she was receiving about her father's activities contained inconsistencies and impossibilities that suggested systematic deception by federal agencies that were more concerned with protecting their own secrets than with protecting national security. Using her prosecutorial authority and security clearance, Isabella began conducting independent investigation of the intelligence reports, investigation that revealed patterns of government deception and illegal activity that extended far beyond her father's situation at Fort Mitchell. The evidence she discovered included documentation of systematic assassination of American citizens, unauthorized weapons development programs, and financial corruption that generated billions of dollars in illegal revenue for shadow government operations. Isabella's investigation triggered additional automated alert systems that indicated her activities were being monitored by the same agencies that were targeting her father, agencies that possessed capabilities and authorities that were normally reserved for dealing with foreign intelligence threats. Her prosecutorial experience had taught her that government agencies were willing to eliminate federal prosecutors who threatened to expose illegal activities, and her mother's death had provided personal confirmation that no American citizen was beyond the reach of agencies that considered themselves above the law. The automated defense systems at installation Mitchell 7 had been designed by engineers who understood that the facility's secrets were valuable enough to justify the elimination of unauthorized personnel, including American citizens who possessed constitutional rights that were supposed to protect them from government violence. The defense systems included non-lethal countermeasures for deterring casual intruders, but they also included lethal capabilities that could eliminate serious threats to operational security. Marcus's knowledge of the defense systems allowed him to navigate through areas that were impassable to the intruders, areas where automated weapon systems, chemical deterrents, and mechanical barriers created kill zones that were designed to prevent unauthorized access to the facility's most sensitive areas. His grandfather's genetic legacy provided him with biometric access to systems that recognized him as authorized personnel despite his lack of official credentials or security clearance. The intruders were discovering that their sophisticated equipment and tactical training were insufficient to overcome defense systems that had been designed by engineers who possessed decades of experience in protecting classified installations from the most advanced threats that foreign intelligence services could deploy. Their communication with federal agencies was being disrupted by electronic warfare systems that could jam encrypted frequencies while monitoring all electronic communications for intelligence gathering purposes. Richard Blackstone was monitoring the situation at Fort Mitchell through surveillance equipment that federal contractors had installed throughout Millbrook, equipment that provided real-time intelligence about activities at the property while maintaining plausible deniability about government involvement in what would officially be classified as a domestic terrorism incident or criminal trespassing case. Blackstone's monitoring capabilities included access to satellite surveillance feeds, electronic intercepts, and communication networks that were normally reserved for classified intelligence operations, capabilities that had been provided by federal contractors who required his cooperation for activities that were too sensitive to be conducted through normal government channels. The intelligence that Blackstone was gathering about the situation at installation Mitchell 7 was being transmitted to federal agencies through encrypted communication channels that bypassed normal oversight and accountability mechanisms. Channels that allowed shadow government operations to continue without congressional knowledge or executive authorization. Blackstone's role in the intelligence operation extended beyond simple surveillance and communication relay to include logistical support for government activities that required plausible deniability and civilian cover. Activities that included the elimination of security threats and the concealment of evidence that could expose illegal government operations. The tactical situation in the underground complex had evolved into a direct confrontation between constitutional government and shadow agencies that operated without legal authority or democratic accountability. Marcus represented the constitutional principle that government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, while the intruders represented agencies that considered themselves above the law and beyond the reach of civilian oversight. The engagement was being conducted with weapons and tactics that were decades ahead of anything that existed in the public sector, weapons that had been developed through classified programs that violated international treaties and domestic laws regarding prohibited weapons systems. The technological capabilities being deployed by both sides represented evidence of government activities that were too illegal and unconstitutional to be acknowledged by any official agency. Marcus's tactical approach was designed not only to defeat the intruders, but to gather evidence of federal crimes being committed during the operation, evidence that could be used to expose the shadow government's activities and bring criminal prosecutions against government officials who had violated their oaths to uphold and defend the Constitution. The intruder's tactical approach was designed to eliminate Marcus as a security threat while destroying all evidence that could expose Installation Mitchell 7's activities, approach that required the violation of constitutional rights and federal laws that were supposed to protect American citizens from government violence and illegal surveillance. The underground complex contained automated recording systems that were documenting every aspect of the engagement for historical preservation and legal accountability, systems that had been designed to ensure that the truth about installation Mitchell 7's activities would eventually be disclosed regardless of the outcome of immediate tactical operations. The recording systems were transmitting encrypted data to secure storage facilities throughout the United States, facilities that were operated by intelligence networks that were committed to exposing illegal government activities regardless of the personal costs involved. The data included video evidence, audio recordings, and technical documentation that provided irrefutable proof of government activities that violated constitutional law and international treaties. Marcus understood that his survival was less important than the preservation and transmission of evidence that could restore constitutional government and bring justice to the thousands of Americans who had been killed to protect government secrets. His tactical decisions were motivated not by personal survival, but by his obligation to complete the mission that his wife Elena had died trying to accomplish. The silver compass that Elena had given him was now functioning as a sophisticated communication device that was coordinating activities between intelligence networks throughout the United States, networks that were preparing to release classified information that would expose the full scope of the shadow government's illegal activities. The compass was transmitting Marcus's evidence about Installation Mitchell 7 to receivers located throughout the country, receivers that were operated by military personnel and intelligence officials who shared his commitment to constitutional government and democratic accountability. The moment of truth had arrived not just for Marcus Rodriguez, but for American democracy itself, as the confrontation of Installation Mitchell 7 would determine whether constitutional government would be restored or whether the shadow government would succeed in eliminating the last serious threat to its continued existence. The outcome of the engagement would be determined not by superior firepower or tactical advantage, but by the willingness of American citizens to defend constitutional principles against domestic enemies who had forgotten their obligation to serve the people rather than their own institutional interests. The transformation began at precisely 4:23 a.m. when Marcus activated the master control system that his grandfather Antonio had secretly installed during Installation Mitchell 7's construction, a system that bypassed all official security protocols and granted him complete administrative authority over the underground complex. The activation sequence required biometric confirmation from 3 generations of the Rodriguez family, confirmation that could only be provided by Marcus's genetic markers, his grandfather's preserved DNA samples, and digital authorization from Elena's stored biometric data. The master control system had been Antonio's insurance policy against the possibility that Installation Mitchell 7's activities would become so illegal and unconstitutional that external intervention would be required to protect American democracy from domestic enemies. The system granted its authorized users access to every classified file, every communication record, and every piece of evidence that documented the shadow government's activities since World War II. As the system activated, holographic displays throughout the underground complex began projecting classified documents that revealed the true scope of Installation Mitchell 7's operations. Operations that included systematic assassination of American citizens, unauthorized weapons development programs, and financial corruption that had generated more than $400 billion in illegal revenue over 7 decades of covert activities. The intruders found themselves surrounded by evidence of the very crimes they had been sent to conceal, evidence that was now being automatically transmitted to intelligence networks throughout the United States and to congressional oversight committees that possessed the authority to investigate and prosecute illegal government activities. Their mission to destroy evidence and eliminate Marcus as a security threat had instead resulted in the exposure of secrets that had been protected by multiple presidential administrations. David Hayes was receiving real-time intelligence updates through secure communication channels that confirmed the successful activation of Installation Mitchell 7's master control system and the transmission of classified evidence to intelligence networks that were committed to restoring constitutional government. The intelligence updates included confirmation that military units loyal to constitutional principles were moving toward Fort Mitchell to secure the facility and protect the evidence from destruction by shadow government agencies. Hayes's role in the intelligence operation extended far beyond his official position as a small-town banker and reserve officer to include coordination of nationwide networks of military personnel, intelligence officials, and government contractors who had been waiting decades for the opportunity to expose illegal activities that were being conducted without congressional authorization or executive oversight. The intelligence networks that Hayes coordinated included personnel from every branch of the military, every intelligence agency, and every federal law enforcement organization, personnel who possessed evidence of systematic violations of constitutional law by agencies that had forgotten their obligation to serve the American people rather than their own institutional interests. Hayes understood that the successful exposure of Installation Mitchell 7's activities would trigger a constitutional crisis that would either result in the restoration of democratic government or in civil war between constitutional forces and shadow agencies that possessed capabilities that were decades ahead of anything that existed in the public sector. Isabella Rodriguez Chun was using her prosecutorial authority to coordinate with federal judges who possessed the security clearances necessary to review classified evidence and issue warrants for the arrest of government officials who had participated in illegal activities at Installation Mitchell 7 and similar facilities throughout the United States. The classified evidence that Isabella was reviewing included documentation of systematic torture and murder of American citizens, evidence that was sufficient to support criminal prosecutions under both domestic and international law for crimes against humanity, treason, and systematic violations of constitutional rights that were protected by the Bill of Rights. Isabella's prosecutorial experience had prepared her for exactly this type of complex criminal investigation involving multiple defendants, multiple jurisdictions, and evidence that was classified at levels that required special security procedures for handling and presentation in federal court. Her security clearance provided her with access to evidence that most federal prosecutors would never be authorized to review. The criminal prosecutions that Isabella was preparing would target government officials at the highest levels of federal agencies, including officials who had served in multiple presidential administrations and who possessed congressional connections that had previously provided them with protection from criminal investigation and prosecution. Isabella understood that the success of the prosecutions would depend on her ability to present classified evidence in ways that protected national security interests while exposing illegal activities that were too serious to be concealed through abuse of classification authorities and executive privilege. Richard Blackstone's surveillance and intelligence gathering activities had provided him with comprehensive documentation of federal crimes being committed by the agencies that had recruited his cooperation, documentation that was now being used as evidence against the same officials who had promised him financial compensation and legal protection for his participation in illegal activities. Blackstone's communication records, financial transactions, and surveillance data were being analyzed by federal investigators who possessed the authority to prosecute civilian contractors who had provided logistical support for illegal government operations, prosecution that could result in criminal penalties that included life imprisonment for treason and conspiracy against constitutional government. The federal contractors who had recruited Blackstone's cooperation were discovering that their promises of legal protection and financial compensation were worthless when the illegal activities they had been conducting were exposed to congressional oversight and federal prosecution by agencies that were loyal to constitutional government rather than shadow operations. Blackstone's real estate development company was being seized by federal authorities as evidence of criminal enterprise that had been used to support illegal intelligence operations. Seizure that included all assets, all financial records, and all communication equipment that had been used to coordinate activities at Installation Mitchell 7. The intruders who had been trapped in Installation Mitchell 7's underground complex were being identified through biometric analysis that revealed their true identities as personnel from multiple federal agencies who had been conducting illegal domestic operations without proper authorization or oversight from civilian authorities. The federal agencies that had deployed the intruders were discovering that their personnel were now in the custody of military units that were loyal to constitutional government and that possessed evidence of systematic violations of federal law that were sufficient to support criminal prosecutions for treason, conspiracy, and systematic violations of constitutional rights. The tactical situation that had begun as an attempt to eliminate Marcus as a security threat had evolved into a complete exposure of the shadow government's illegal activities and the arrest of personnel who had participated in systematic violations of constitutional law for decades without accountability or oversight. The automated recording systems at Installation Mitchell 7 had documented every aspect of the federal intrusion for use as evidence in criminal prosecutions that would expose the full scope of illegal government activities that had been conducted without congressional authorization or executive oversight since World War II. Marcus's tactical victory over the intruders represented more than successful defense of his property or personal survival, but the successful completion of a constitutional mission that would restore democratic government and bring justice to thousands of Americans who had been killed to protect government secrets that were too illegal and unconstitutional to be disclosed through normal democratic processes. The evidence that Marcus had preserved and transmitted through Alina's compass was now being reviewed by congressional oversight committees that possessed the authority to investigate illegal government activities and to recommend criminal prosecutions for government officials who had violated their oaths to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The $400 million in government secrets that had been buried beneath Fort Mitchell represented evidence of criminal activities that extended to the highest levels of federal government, activities that included systematic corruption, illegal weapons development, unauthorized detention and torture of American citizens, and financial fraud that had generated billions of dollars in illegal revenue for shadow government operations. The financial records that were being analyzed by federal investigators revealed that Installation Mitchell 7 had been funded through black budget allocations that were hidden within legitimate defense contracts, allocations that had been approved by government officials who possessed congressional and executive connections that had previously provided them with protection from oversight and accountability. The weapons development programs that had been conducted at Installation Mitchell 7 included prototypes that violated international treaties and domestic laws regarding prohibited weapon systems, prototypes that had been developed using technologies that were decades ahead of anything that existed in the public sector or in the arsenals of foreign governments. The detention and interrogation facilities that had been operated at Installation Mitchell 7 included evidence of systematic torture and murder of American citizens who had discovered evidence of illegal government activities, evidence that was sufficient to support criminal prosecutions under both domestic and international law for crimes against humanity and systematic violations of constitutional rights. Marcus Rodriguez's mission had been successful beyond anything that he had hoped to accomplish when he made the decision to purchase Fort Mitchell and expose the truth about Installation Mitchell 7. His evidence was now being used to restore constitutional government and bring justice to Americans who had died protecting the democracy that shadow government agencies had tried to destroy. The silver compass that Elena had given him had served as both navigation tool and communication device throughout his mission. But it had also served as a symbol of the moral direction that was necessary to distinguish between legitimate government authority and illegal activities that violated the constitutional principles that defined American democracy. The constitutional crisis that had been triggered by the exposure of Installation Mitchell 7's activities would either result in the restoration of democratic government or in the complete transformation of American society into a police state that was controlled by shadow agencies that possessed capabilities and authorities that were incompatible with constitutional government and individual liberty. Marcus understood that his personal survival was less important than the preservation of constitutional government and the protection of future generations of Americans from the kind of systematic oppression that had been conducted by shadow agencies for more than 70 years without democratic accountability or oversight. The victory at Installation Mitchell 7 represented the beginning of the most important constitutional restoration in American history. Restoration that would either succeed in returning government to the control of the American people or result in civil war between constitutional forces and shadow agencies that had forgotten their obligation to serve democracy rather than their own institutional interests. The transformation of American government had begun in the underground tunnels of Installation Mitchell 7, but its completion would require the continued vigilance and commitment of American citizens who understood that democracy required constant protection from enemies both foreign and domestic who sought to replace constitutional government with authoritarian control that served elite interests rather than the common good. The dawn that broke over Fort Mitchell 6 months later illuminated a landscape transformed beyond recognition, not just physically but symbolically, as the former military installation had become the epicenter of the most significant constitutional restoration in American history. The chain-link fences and crumbling concrete that had once hidden America's darkest secrets now surrounded a memorial complex where visitors from around the world came to understand how close democratic government had come to complete destruction by domestic enemies who had operated without accountability for over 7 decades. Marcus Rodriguez stood at the entrance to what was now known as the Constitutional Restoration Memorial, watching as families with children read the bronze plaques that documented the systematic violations of constitutional law that had been conducted at Installation Mitchell 7 and similar facilities throughout the United States. The plaques contained carefully edited versions of the classified evidence that Marcus had preserved and transmitted, evidence that had resulted in criminal prosecutions that extended to the highest levels of government and had fundamentally transformed how Americans understood the relationship between citizens and their government. The memorial complex had been constructed using funds that were recovered from the shadow government's illegal operations, funds that represented only a small fraction of the $400 billion in illegal revenue that had been generated through decades of criminal activities. The recovered funds were being used not only for memorial construction, but for victim compensation programs that provided financial assistance to families of Americans who had been killed to protect government secrets that were too illegal and unconstitutional to be disclosed through normal democratic processes. David Hayes had been appointed as the memorial's first director, using his banking experience and military intelligence background to oversee programs that educated visitors about the importance of constitutional government and the eternal vigilance required to protect democracy from enemies both foreign and domestic. Hayes understood that the memorial's educational mission was essential for ensuring that future generations would possess the knowledge and commitment necessary to prevent the rise of another shadow government. The memorial's most popular exhibit was the Elena Rodriguez Memorial Library, which contained declassified documents, photographs, and audio recordings that provided comprehensive documentation of the shadow government's activities from World War II through the present day. The library had been designed as both an educational resource and a research facility where scholars, journalists, and government oversight personnel could access information that was essential for understanding how democratic institutions could be corrupted, and how constitutional restoration could be achieved. Isabella Rodriguez Chin had resigned her position as a federal prosecutor to serve as the memorial's chief legal counsel, using her prosecutorial experience and security clearance to coordinate ongoing criminal investigations and civil rights lawsuits that were designed to provide justice for victims of government crimes and to prevent future violations of constitutional law. Isabella's legal work included coordination with international human rights organizations that were investigating American government activities that violated international treaties and conventions regarding torture, assassination, and illegal detention. The criminal prosecutions that resulted from the installation Mitchell 7 revelations had fundamentally transformed American government by eliminating shadow agencies and restoring congressional oversight over intelligence operations and military activities that had operated without authorization or accountability for decades. More than 300 government officials had been convicted of treason, conspiracy, and systematic violations of constitutional rights, convictions that included former cabinet members, intelligence directors, and military commanders who had forgotten their oaths to uphold and defend the Constitution. Richard Blackstone had cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced criminal penalties, providing testimony and documentation that exposed the civilian contractor. Networks that had provided logistical support and plausible deniability for illegal government operations. Blackstone's cooperation had resulted in the exposure and prosecution of hundreds of private contractors and corporate executives who had profited from activities that violated both constitutional law and international treaties regarding human rights and democratic government. The Blackstone Development Company had been dissolved and its assets distributed to victim compensation programs, but Richard Blackstone himself had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his participation in activities that threatened constitutional government and violated the civil rights of American citizens. Blackstone's sentence had been reduced in recognition of his cooperation with investigators, but federal judges had determined that civilian participation in shadow government activities required criminal penalties that would deter future cooperation with illegal government operations. The intelligence networks that had supported Marcus's mission had been formally incorporated into new oversight mechanisms that were designed to prevent the rise of unauthorized government activities and to ensure that military and intelligence operations remained under civilian control and congressional oversight. The networks included personnel from every branch of government who were committed to constitutional principles and who possessed the security clearances and technical capabilities necessary to monitor government activities and prevent future violations of constitutional law. Marcus's role in the constitutional restoration had earned him recognition as one of the most important patriots in American history. Recognition that included congressional medals, university honorary degrees, and international human rights awards that acknowledged his contribution to the global struggle for democratic government and individual liberty. But Marcus understood that recognition was less important than the ongoing work of protecting constitutional government from future threats. The silver compass that Elena had given him was now displayed in the memorial's central exhibit hall, where visitors could see the device that had preserved and transmitted the evidence that exposed the shadow government's activities and restored constitutional democracy. The compass was accompanied by photographs of Elena and Antonio Rodriguez, whose contributions to the constitutional restoration were being honored alongside Marcus's more visible role in the final exposure of Installation Mitchell 7. The memorial's educational programs included guided tours that took visitors through reconstructed sections of Installation Mitchell 7's underground complex, tours that provided visceral understanding of how government secrecy could be used to conceal activities that violated every principle of democratic government and individual liberty. The tours were conducted by military veterans and intelligence professionals who possessed first-hand knowledge of government activities and who could explain how classification authorities and executive privilege had been abused to protect criminal activities. The underground complex had been preserved as a historical site that documented the dangers of unlimited government power and the importance of citizen vigilance in protecting constitutional rights from government encroachment. The preservation included the automated defense systems, the classified laboratories, and the detention facilities that had been used to torture and murder American citizens who had discovered evidence of illegal government activities. Marcus spent his evenings writing a comprehensive account of his mission and the constitutional restoration that had resulted from the exposure of Installation Mitchell 7, an account that was being prepared for publication as both a historical record and an educational resource for future generations, who would inherit the responsibility for protecting democratic government from enemies both foreign and domestic. Book would include declassified documents, photographs, and personal accounts that provided complete documentation of how the shadow government had operated and how constitutional restoration had been achieved through the courage and sacrifice of Americans who had chosen to honor their oaths to the Constitution rather than their loyalty to illegal government institutions. Marcus understood that his story was not unique in American history, but represented the eternal struggle between constitutional government and authoritarian power that had defined American democracy since its founding. His mission had been successful not because of his individual capabilities, but because he had been supported by networks of Americans who shared his commitment to constitutional principles and democratic accountability. The constitutional restoration that had begun at Installation Mitchell 7 was continuing throughout American society as citizens became more aware of the importance of government transparency and accountability. Awareness that was resulting in stronger oversight mechanisms and greater protection for whistleblowers and government accountability advocates who exposed illegal activities and constitutional violations. Marcus's legacy would not be measured by the recognition he had received or the memorial that bore his family's name, but by the constitutional protections that had been restored and strengthened through his mission. The shadow government that had threatened American democracy for more than 70 years had been eliminated, but Marcus understood that eternal vigilance would be required to prevent the rise of similar threats in the future. As visitors from around the world walked through the Constitutional Restoration Memorial, they were reminded that democracy was not a guarantee but a responsibility that required active participation and constant vigilance from citizens who understood that government derived its authority from the consent of the governed and that constitutional rights could only be protected through the courage and commitment of ordinary Americans who were willing to defend their liberty against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The story of Marcus Rodriguez and Installation Mitchell 7 had become a symbol of hope for people throughout the world who were struggling against authoritarian governments and illegal activities by officials who had forgotten their obligation to serve the people rather than their own interests. The constitutional restoration that had been achieved in the United States was inspiring similar movements throughout the world as citizens demanded transparency, accountability, and respect for human rights from their governments. Marcus Rodriguez had proven that individual Americans possessed the power to restore constitutional government and protect democracy from its enemies. But he had also demonstrated that success required the support and cooperation of citizens who shared a commitment to constitutional principles and democratic values. His mission had been completed, but the work of protecting constitutional government would continue for as long as Americans valued liberty more than security and democracy more than convenience. The dawn over Fort Mitchell represented not just the end of one man's mission, but the beginning of a new era in American democracy, an era in which government transparency and constitutional accountability would be protected by citizens who understood that freedom required constant vigilance, and that democracy was worth any sacrifice necessary to preserve it for future generations. If the story of courage, sacrifice, and constitutional restoration has inspired you to learn more about protecting democracy and holding government accountable. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary Americans who made extraordinary contributions to preserving liberty and constitutional government. Like this video if you believe that truth and transparency are essential for democratic government, and share it with others who need to understand that individual Americans possess the power to defend their constitutional rights against any enemy, foreign or domestic. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you stories that matter, stories that remind us why democracy is worth defending, and why constitutional government requires the active participation of citizens who refuse to surrender their liberty to those who would rule without consent or accountability. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.